It was a late afternoon in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when U.S. Army Lieutenant Michael Harris found himself at the center of an unsettling and harrowing encounter. Driving home in his recently washed, sleek black SUV, Lieutenant Harris had just left the base, still in uniform, after completing a long but fulfilling day of training his unit. The streets were calm, the golden hues of the setting sun painting the cityscape with serenity. Suddenly, the stillness of the evening was shattered by the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. Startled but composed, Michael signaled, pulled over, and brought his vehicle to a stop. With his training kicking in, he kept his hands on the wheel, a military-grade discipline evident in his every move. Officer aggression unfolds. The officer who approached his vehicle carried an air of overt authority, but it was coupled with an aggression that seemed unnecessary. Without greeting or offering an explanation, the officer barked a demand: "Step out of the vehicle." The lack of context was startling, but Michael complied without hesitation, slowly unbuckling his seatbelt and exiting the car. As Michael stepped out, his posture upright, his hands visible to avoid any misunderstanding, the tension escalated. He calmly asked, "Is there an issue, officer?" Instead of receiving an answer, he was met with an action that would haunt him for years to come. The officer, without warning, raised his pepper spray and discharged it directly into Michael's face. The sharp sting and burning sensation overwhelmed him. He staggered back, his instincts fighting against the onslaught of pain. "Why?" he managed to choke out between fits of coughing, his eyes clenched shut as the chemical agent scorched his vision. The role of witnesses. At that very moment, several pedestrians nearby were drawn to the scene. Sarah Dixon, a local teacher on her way home from the grocery store, was among them. Outraged and confused, Sarah pulled out her phone and began recording. "What are you doing to him?" she shouted, her voice quivering with a mix of fear and anger. Other bystanders joined her, some taking videos while others yelled at the officer to stop. "He hasn't done anything wrong," one man exclaimed, pointing at Michael's uniform, a symbol of his service to the country. As the crowd grew louder, the officer seemed momentarily stunned, glancing nervously at the bystanders but maintaining his aggressive stance. "Stand back," he barked, but his words only fueled the outrage. The tension was palpable, the street alive with a cacophony of disbelief and indignation. Escalation and humiliation. Michael, struggling to regain his bearings, attempted to explain himself. "I am a serving officer in the United States Army," he gasped. But his words were met with disdain. The officer, ignoring the context, twisted Michael's arms behind his back and slammed him against the hood of his own SUV. The metallic thud reverberated, drawing gasps from the crowd. "Is this how you treat a soldier?" someone screamed. Sarah's voice cracked as she yelled, "You're violating his rights." Another witness, an older man with a Vietnam veteran cap, stepped forward and shouted, "You've crossed the line, officer." Instead of de-escalating, the officer doubled down, accusing Michael of resisting arrest. The words were chilling and ironic, given Michael's compliance throughout the ordeal. A nation watches. As the video streamed live on various social media platforms, the incident began trending. #JusticeForLT Harris started appearing on Twitter and Instagram within minutes. Viewers across the country were outraged as they watched the brutal treatment of a man whose uniform symbolized honor and sacrifice. The officer, realizing the gravity of the public outcry, called for backup. More police vehicles arrived, creating a spectacle that further drew attention. Michael, now seated on the curb in handcuffs, his uniform dampened with sweat and streaked from the pepper spray, sat in silent humiliation as the crowd continued to voice their outrage. Racism and underlying tension. It was impossible to ignore the racial dynamics at play. As a black man in uniform, Michael's presence seemed to incite a reaction from the officer that was as irrational as it was calculated. "If he wasn't black, this wouldn't be happening," someone in the crowd muttered loudly, sparking murmurs of agreement. Sarah, still recording, voiced the question on everyone's mind. "Would you have done this if he were white? Or is it just easier to see a black man as a threat, even in uniform?" Her words hung heavy in the air, unanswered but undeniable. Aftermath at the scene. Eventually, another officer arrived, a sergeant who took control of the situation. Assessing the scene and the growing unrest among the onlookers, he approached Michael cautiously. "Are you okay, sir?" the sergeant asked, his tone markedly different from the earlier officer's hostility. Michael, his voice hoarse and vision blurry, responded, "No, I'm not okay. I've been assaulted for no reason." The sergeant ordered the arresting officer to remove the cuffs. Reluctantly, the officer complied, but his expression remained defiant. As Michael was helped to his feet, applause erupted from the crowd. Unanswered questions. Even as Michael was freed, the questions loomed large. Why had the officer stopped him in the first place? What had justified such a violent response? These were questions that would spark an investigation, ignite protests, and lead to a broader national conversation about race, authority, and justice. As Michael sat in an ambulance being treated for the effects of the pepper spray, Sarah approached. "We've got your back," she said softly, her phone still in hand, the video still rolling. For Michael, her words were a small but significant solace in a moment of profound humiliation and pain. This was more than just a routine stop gone wrong. It was a mirror reflecting the systemic issues still plaguing the nation. The video of Lieutenant Michael Harris's harrowing encounter quickly exploded across social media platforms. Sarah Dixon's recording, filled with raw anger and disbelief, garnered millions of views within hours. The clip showed Michael in his crisp army uniform, being pepper sprayed and slammed onto the hood of his SUV while maintaining his composure amid the chaos. The hashtags #JusticeForLT Harris and #StopPoliceBrutality trended globally. The incident had struck a nerve, reigniting fierce debates about race, authority, and accountability in America. A nation reacts. Comments flooded in under the video, ranging from anger to solidarity. "This is what they do to a decorated soldier. Imagine what happens to civilians," one user wrote. "Being black in America is always a crime to them," another commented. Prominent activists such as Angela Whitfield and Professor Marcus Green reposted the video, calling for justice and immediate accountability. The outrage wasn't just confined to social media. By the next morning, news outlets across the country ran the story, airing the damning footage with captions like "Officer Assaults Army Lieutenant in Albuquerque" and "Racial Profiling in Uniform." Veterans groups were particularly vocal. Michael's calm and composed demeanor in the face of aggression resonated with those who had served. Retired Marine Sergeant Linda Rodriguez appeared on national television, her voice trembling with emotion. "This man has served his country. He swore to defend the very Constitution this officer trampled on. Where's the respect?" she demanded. Civil rights organizations mobilized almost immediately. The National Coalition for Racial Justice announced a protest outside the Albuquerque Police Department, and the Black Veterans Alliance pledged to stand behind Michael in seeking accountability. A web of complaints unveiled. As public pressure mounted, journalists began digging into the officer involved in the assault. His name, Officer Gerald Whitman, soon became public knowledge, and it unleashed a storm of revelations. Investigative reporters from the Albuquerque Sentinel discovered that Whitman had a long history of complaints filed against him, many of them involving excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. One particularly chilling account came from a local teacher, Marcos Jimenez, who revealed he was pulled over by Whitman a year prior for a broken taillight. "He called me a spick and shoved me against my car. I didn't fight back because I knew it wouldn't end well," Jimenez recounted. His story was one of dozens that surfaced as Whitman's file of grievances was laid bare. Even more damning was the systemic protection afforded to Whitman by his department. Internal memos leaked to the press showed complaints being dismissed without investigation. A whistleblower within the precinct claimed that Whitman was known for his temper but was seen as untouchable due to his connections within the police union. Michael's humiliation intensifies. While the nation rallied behind him, Michael himself was reeling from the aftermath. His commanding officer informed him that the incident had sparked an internal military inquiry into his conduct during the traffic stop, a routine procedure but one that felt like an additional layer of punishment. "Why am I under investigation for being assaulted?" Michael asked in disbelief, his voice breaking. He returned to his unit the following week, only to find whispers and stolen glances among his fellow soldiers. Despite their expressions of support, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that some questioned his actions during the encounter. The humiliation lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. Racism and reluctance. The undercurrent of racism surrounding the incident became more apparent as details emerged. During an interview with a local news outlet, Whitman's lawyer issued a defensive statement. The officer acted within protocol. He perceived a threat, she said, emphasizing the words threat as though Michael's uniform wasn't enough to dispel it. The implication was clear. Michael's blackness had overshadowed his service, his uniform, and his humanity. Protests outside the Albuquerque Police Department grew larger each day. Signs bearing phrases like, "Not all threats are blacked" and "Uniform doesn't cancel skin color" dotted the streets. Sarah Dixon, now hailed as a hero, became a prominent voice in the movement. She gave interviews recounting the incident, her voice laced with righteous anger. "I don't know what scares me more," she told one reporter, "that they did this to a soldier or that they would have killed him if we weren't there." Escalating threats. As the pressure mounted, Michael began receiving anonymous threats. Phone calls, emails, and even notes left on his windshield warned him to stay quiet and accused him of disrespecting law enforcement. One email went further, stating, "You're just another thug hiding behind a uniform. We'll see how brave you are without it." Despite the harassment, Michael refused to stay silent. "I took an oath to serve and protect this country," he said during a press conference organized by the National Coalition for Racial Justice. "I won't let fear stop me from standing up for what's right." Whitman's downfall. The tide finally turned when a damning video from another incident involving Whitman surfaced. In the clip, he could be heard berating a young Latina mother during a routine stop, calling her a welfare queen and threatening to take her children away. This, combined with mounting public pressure, forced the Albuquerque Police Department to suspend him pending investigation. In an unprecedented move, the department also announced a full audit of its complaint handling processes. The chief of police, visibly shaken during a press conference, admitted, "We have failed in our duty to hold our officers accountable. We must do better." The nation holds its breath. As protests grew and investigations deepened, Michael found himself at the heart of a national reckoning. The dual identities he carried, as a soldier and a black man, symbolized the broader struggle against systemic racism and abuse of power. But for Michael, it wasn't about being a symbol. It was about justice, dignity, and ensuring no one else, uniformed or not, would endure what he had. The decision to file a lawsuit wasn't easy for Michael Harris. As a decorated Army lieutenant, he had spent his life serving a system that now seemed stacked against him. But the humiliation he endured, the blatant violation of his rights, and the overwhelming public support pushed him to take a stand. Michael, determined to seek justice, retained Amelia Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney known for her fearlessness in taking on systemic racism and police misconduct. Amelia Carter was a force to be reckoned with. A black woman who had fought, and won, numerous cases against powerful institutions, she approached Michael's case with a fiery determination. "This isn't just about you, Lieutenant Harris," she told him during their first meeting. "It's about every black man and woman who's been stopped, harassed, or brutalized simply for existing. We're going to make them answer for this." Building a strong case. Amelia and her team got to work immediately, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing the damning video footage. Sarah Dixon, the courageous bystander whose video brought the incident to light, was one of the first to testify. "I've never seen anything like it," she said during a deposition, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "He was calm, respectful, and compliant. They attacked him for no reason, except the color of his skin." Other witnesses came forward, bolstered by the national outcry. Marcos Jimenez, a teacher who had his own traumatic experience with Officer Gerald Whitman, recounted his story in detail. "It's not just this one time," he said. "It's a pattern. Whitman has a problem with people who look like me or Lieutenant Harris." Amelia also obtained critical internal police documents leaked by a whistleblower. The emails and memos painted a damning picture of systemic discrimination within the Albuquerque Police Department. One chilling email from a superior officer dismissed a complaint against Whitman, stating, "Just another perp playing the race card. Let it go." Another memo revealed discussions about how to suppress complaints to avoid public scrutiny. These revelations sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the nation. Facing humiliation in court. The trial began with a packed courtroom. Michael, in his crisp Army uniform, sat beside Amelia as Officer Whitman and representatives from the Albuquerque Police Department took their seats across the aisle. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Whitman entered the room with an air of arrogance, smirking as if he believed he was untouchable. The defense attempted to portray Michael as aggressive and non-compliant, a tactic that infuriated observers and drew gasps from the audience when they referenced his race. He posed a threat, Whitman's attorney argued, ignoring the footage that showed Michael calmly complying with orders. Amelia's response was swift and devastating. What threat does a man pose with his hands up, in uniform, following every command? The only threat Lieutenant Harris posed was to Officer Whitman's prejudices. The defense also claimed Whitman had acted within department protocols, but Amelia eviscerated this argument. These protocols aren't worth the paper they're printed on if they allow officers to assault citizens without justification, she thundered. Her cross-examination of Whitman was a masterclass in dismantling lies. Are you saying you didn't notice his uniform? That you couldn't see the rank insignia on his chest, she pressed, forcing Whitman to stumble over his words. As the trial continued, the humiliation Michael felt during the incident resurfaced. Watching the video played repeatedly in court was agonizing. He saw himself being pepper-sprayed, slammed against his car, and mocked by the officer while doing everything in his power to remain calm. But Michael's resolve only hardened. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every victim who never got their day in court. A landmark verdict. After weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the jury deliberated. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Michael sat stoically, his hands folded on the table, while Sarah Dixon and other supporters filled the gallery behind him. When the verdict was read, the room erupted in a mix of relief and outrage. The jury found Officer Whitman and the Albuquerque Police Department liable for violating Michael's constitutional rights. The court ordered Whitman to personally pay $250,000 in damages, a rare move in civil cases involving police officers. The department was also ordered to pay $2.5 million in compensation to Michael and implement sweeping reforms, including mandatory body cameras, anti-bias training, and the establishment of an independent oversight board. The judge, in a scathing rebuke, addressed Whitman directly. Your actions were not those of a peacekeeper but a predator. This court hopes you never wear a badge again. Aftermath and reform. The verdict sent ripples through the nation. Protests turned into celebrations as activists and supporters hailed the decision as a victory for justice. Amelia Carter, flanked by Michael and Sarah, held a press conference on the courthouse steps. This is a step forward, but it's only the beginning, Amelia said. We need to hold every officer, every department accountable. The fight doesn't end here. Michael, though relieved, was emotionally drained. This isn't about revenge, he told reporters. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. The Albuquerque Police Department scrambled to rebuild its shattered reputation. The police chief resigned amid mounting public pressure, and several other officers with histories of misconduct were placed under investigation. Officer Whitman, now a pariah, faced the possibility of criminal charges. Healing and moving forward. For Michael, the road to healing was long and complicated. He returned to his unit with his head held high, though he still faced whispers and questions about the incident. The support from veterans organizations and civil rights groups became his lifeline, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Sarah Dixon, whose bravery in recording and sharing the video had sparked the entire movement, became an advocate for police reform. I was just doing what anyone should do, she told reporters. We need to look out for each other because clearly, the system won't. Amelia Carter, emboldened by the victory, vowed to continue her work. This is what justice looks like, she said. One case at a time, We're going to dismantle these systems of oppression. The victory in court was a turning point, but Michael knew the battle for justice was far from over. As he walked away from the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters chanting his name, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change, however slow and painful, was possible. Michael Harris's journey did not end with the courtroom victory or the reforms within the Albuquerque Police Department. His story became a rallying cry for a growing movement against systemic injustice and racial bias in law enforcement. Across the country, people from all walks of life looked to Michael as proof of the power of community and the need to confront wrongdoing, no matter how daunting the challenge. A movement takes root. The momentum sparked by Michael's case ignited a wave of grassroots activism. Rallies, town hall meetings, and forums sprang up in cities nationwide. Michael's name became synonymous with resistance to oppression and a reminder that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. At each gathering, Michael's presence electrified the crowd. Standing tall in his army uniform, he was more than a man. He was a symbol of what could be achieved when ordinary people stood together. Michael often began his speeches with a raw recounting of his ordeal. "I wasn't just humiliated that day," he told a packed auditorium in Chicago. "I was stripped of my humanity by someone who saw my skin color as a threat. But I refused to let that be the final chapter of my story. And neither should you." The audience erupted in applause, many on their feet. Amelia Carter, sitting in the front row, smiled as she watched Michael transform into a leader before her eyes. Beside her, Sarah Dixon nodded, her phone in hand as she live-streamed the event to thousands of followers. Challenges in the spotlight. While Michael's story inspired many, it also drew backlash. Online forums and social media became battlegrounds where supporters clashed with critics. Detractors accused Michael of playing the victim or seeking fame, while some went further, spewing racist vitriol that underscored the very issues Michael was fighting against. At one event in Texas, a group of counter-protesters stood outside the venue, waving signs that read "Support the Balloon" and shouting taunts as Michael approached. "You think you're special because you're a soldier?" one man sneered. "You're just another thug trying to stir up trouble." Michael stopped, turning to face the man directly. "If speaking out against injustice makes me a troublemaker," he said, his voice calm but firm, "then I'll wear that label proudly." The exchange, captured by Sarah and shared online, went viral. It became a defining moment in Michael's journey, a reminder that courage often means standing tall in the face of hate. Sarah Dixon's unwavering support. Sarah's role in the movement grew alongside Michael's. Her decision to record and share the initial incident had made her a target of criticism and harassment. Anonymous messages flooded her inbox, accusing her of being anti-police and threatening her safety. But Sarah refused to back down. "Someone once told me that if you're making people uncomfortable, you're doing something right," she said during a radio interview. "I won't stop until people like Michael can walk down the street without fear of being judged by the color of their skin." Her involvement in the Civilian Oversight Board in Albuquerque became a blueprint for other cities. Sarah tirelessly worked to ensure that complaints were taken seriously and that officers who abused their power faced consequences. Her efforts began to show results. Complaints decreased, community trust improved, and even some officers acknowledged the need for change. Amelia Carter's continued fight. Amelia Carter, emboldened by the victory in Michael's case, became a leading figure in the fight for justice. She took on more cases of police misconduct, many of them involving racial bias. Each victory added fuel to the growing movement, but Amelia remained grounded, often crediting Michael for inspiring her renewed drive. "He reminded me why I started this work in the first place," she said during a legal symposium. "Because behind every statistic is a person, a life that matters." Amelia's work extended beyond the courtroom. She launched initiatives to educate marginalized communities about their rights, empowering them to challenge abuses of power. At every turn, she cited Michael's case as proof that the fight, though difficult, was worth it. The burden of leadership. Despite the progress, Michael carried the weight of his role heavily. He often felt like he was fighting a war on two fronts, against systemic injustice and against the personal toll of his experience. Nightmares of the traffic stop haunted him, and the pressure of being a public figure left him feeling exposed. One evening, after a rally in Atlanta, Michael confided in Sarah and Amelia. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to keep going," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Every time I speak about that day, I relive it. Sometimes I just want to forget." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Michael. We're all in this fight together." Amelia added, "Your strength doesn't come from pretending you're invincible. It comes from showing up, even when it's hard." Their words bolstered Michael, reminding him that leadership didn't mean carrying the burden alone. A legacy of change. As the movement continued to grow, Michael's story began to change laws and lives. Cities across the nation implemented civilian oversight boards and bias training modeled after Albuquerque's reforms. Police departments faced increased scrutiny, and officers like Gerald Whitman found themselves on the losing side of history. Michael often reflected on the power of community. "This isn't just my fight," he said during a speech at a national civil rights conference. "It's ours. Every voice matters. Every action counts. Together, we're unstoppable." Sarah's videos, Amelia's legal victories, and Michael's speeches became cornerstones of the movement, showing that change was possible when people refused to remain silent. For every challenge, there was progress. For every setback, there was resilience. In the end, Michael's journey was not just about overcoming his own humiliation but about ensuring that no one else would endure the same. As he stood before yet another crowd, their chants echoing around him, Michael knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But he also knew that he wasn't fighting alone, and that made all the difference. Michael Harris stepped fully into his new role as a symbol of justice, traveling across the country to share his story and inspire others to confront systemic racism and inequality. His presence at rallies, community events, and universities became a powerful reminder of what could happen when ordinary citizens refused to stay silent. Dressed in his army uniform, Michael's image commanded respect, but it was his unflinching honesty and emotional vulnerability that resonated with audiences. The weight of humiliation. Each speech Michael gave was a stark reminder of the humiliation he had endured. Standing on stages in front of packed auditoriums, he often recounted the moment Officer Gerald Whitman pepper-sprayed him without cause. "It wasn't just the spray that burned," he told one audience. "It was the way he looked at me, like I wasn't even human. It was the jeers, the assumption that my blackness erased my service, my uniform, my dignity." The rawness of his words brought many to tears. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shared pain, especially among Black men and women in the crowd who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. Yet Michael never let his audience dwell in despair. "They tried to strip me of my humanity," he would say, his voice rising with conviction, "but they failed. And they'll fail again if we stand together." Sarah Dixon's tireless advocacy. Sarah Dixon, the woman who had captured the video of Michael's assault, continued to stand by his side. Her voice became an essential part of the movement, and her video footage served as both evidence and a rallying cry. Sarah often joined Michael on stage, sharing her own perspective as a witness and an ally. "People ask me all the time why I stepped in that day," she said at one event, her voice cracking with emotion. "And the answer is simple: because what I saw was wrong. It doesn't take courage to do what's right. It takes humanity." Sarah's role wasn't without challenges. She became the target of vicious online harassment and received threatening messages. Critics accused her of fueling division, calling her anti-police and even questioning her motives. But Sarah refused to back down, channeling the hatred she faced into her work on the Albuquerque Civilian Oversight Board. Under her leadership, the board tackled cases of misconduct head-on, earning a reputation for fairness and tenacity. Amelia Carter's ongoing fight. Amelia Carter, the attorney who had won Michael's case, became a national figure in her own right. She often introduced Michael at events, framing his story within the broader context of systemic reform. "Michael's fight isn't unique," she would say. "It's part of a larger struggle, a struggle that too many have faced and too few have won." Amelia continued to represent victims of police brutality, using Michael's victory as a precedent in her cases. Her legal team expanded, taking on class action lawsuits against departments with histories of abuse. She also worked to draft legislation that would standardize bias training and increase accountability nationwide. But Amelia's work wasn't just in the courtroom. She created workshops to educate communities about their rights during police encounters. "Knowledge is power," she often said, echoing a refrain that had become central to the movement. "If they know your rights, they can't take them away." Michael confronts racism head-on. As Michael's visibility grew, so did the backlash. Racist taunts and thinly veiled threats followed him from city to city. At one event, a man in the crowd yelled, "Go back to where you came from." The comment sparked outrage, but Michael remained calm. "I know exactly where I came from," he responded, looking directly at the heckler. "I came from a country that promises justice and equality. And I'm here to make sure it delivers." These encounters, though draining, became defining moments in Michael's journey. Each time he faced hate, he used it to strengthen his message. "This isn't about me," he told reporters after the incident. "This is about a system that allows hate to thrive. We're here to dismantle it." The burden of leadership. Behind closed doors, the weight of Michael's role often overwhelmed him. The constant retelling of his trauma left emotional scars, and the pressure to represent an entire movement felt suffocating. "Sometimes, I feel like I can't breathe," he confided to Sarah and Amelia one evening after an event. "Like I'm carrying everyone's pain on my shoulders." Sarah was quick to reassure him. "You're not alone in this, Michael. You've got us, and you've got an entire movement behind you." Amelia added, "Leadership isn't about being unbreakable. It's about showing up even when you're hurting. And you do that every single day." Their words gave Michael strength, but the struggle was constant. He found solace in the letters and messages he received from supporters, veterans, students, and even police officers who admired his courage. "Your story saved me," one letter read. "It reminded me that staying silent isn't an option." A legacy of inspiration. Michael's work began to yield tangible results. Cities across the nation adopted reforms inspired by Albuquerque's changes, including the establishment of oversight boards and mandatory bias training. Community police relations began to improve, though progress was slow and uneven. Michael often reminded his audiences that the fight was far from over. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said during a televised interview. "It's a marathon, not a sprint. But every step we take brings us closer to justice." For those who had been with him from the beginning, Sarah Dixon, Amelia Carter, and countless others, Michael's journey was proof of the power of resilience and unity. His speeches became rallying cries, his story a blueprint for activism. Even as he continued to face racism and hostility, Michael remained steadfast. "They can try to humiliate me," he said at a rally in Washington, D.C., "but they'll never silence me. Because I'm not just speaking for myself, I'm speaking for all of us." In every city he visited, every stage he stood on, and every person he inspired, Michael Harris carried a message of hope and determination. His story wasn't just about the past, it was about building a future where justice wasn't an aspiration, but a reality. And he knew that as long as people stood together, that future was within reach.